Thank you for being here on a Sunday evening without church for this presentation. I'm very excited to be giving it to you and wanted to do a little bit of introduction, and then obviously we're going to pray, and then we're going to be talking. If you don't have the handout, you might want to get it. We're not using slides. This is totally old school presentation. Welcome if you're live streaming, if you're watching online. We're really glad that you're here. And you can, if you have another device, go onto our church website. And is it under resources, Katie?
It's under news items.
It's under news items. You can access the notes, so you can have the notes on your phone and the live stream on your computer, or however you like to do that. And if you would like to see these notes again later in electronic form, they're also there under the news items. So let's talk about what we're doing tonight, where we think we're going to be going, and where I hope we're going to end up. And that is, we're going to be taking a look at what is known technically as critical theory, sometimes called critical race theory, known more colloquially as cultural Marxism, expressed often, sometimes we talk about it as cancel culture. I'm going to be using the phrase critical theory more often because it's the chosen language of the group that has the theory, so that it doesn't feel like I'm just bashing them by using a name. So that's what we're going to be doing. Let me say just a little bit by way of introduction. We're a church. We're here. This is a church function for a group of people who have a voluntary association gathered around a particular set of beliefs. We are biased because we have a worldview. We see the world through a lens. We're not a university. We're not a public debating society. We come here to get a particular perspective on both history and the issues of the day. So if at any point you think, man, you are just so biased. Yes, of course I am. Absolutely. And one of the great things about that is we're biased in the sense of tradition with a capital T. There is a certain body of knowledge, there's a certain history, there's a certain perspective that has been passed on for generations. 3,500 years in Judeo-Christian heritage, 2,000 years in Christian heritage, and those of us who are leaders or who feel the burden of that tradition feel an obligation to pass on that tradition to every generation. So in one sense, I'm a person under obligation. I have a 2,000-year history that I have vowed that I will uphold and express. On the other hand, every generation has to encounter the tradition of our faith in its particular cultural, political climate. We have to interact with whatever is going on in the day, and that's where this intersection comes tonight. So I think it's pretty helpful to know that as a church, in a country like ours that allows the free expression of religion, people are free to voluntarily bind themselves to a society of people according to particular beliefs and rules that they have freely said, these are the things to which we will adhere. That's one of the things we get to do as Americans. That is so wonderful. And so we've bound ourselves. Anyone who's a member of our church has taken the vows about particular views about who God is, who Jesus is, what human nature is, and to see it through the particular lens of capital T tradition as it's come filtered through the Presbyterian tradition. So that's what we're doing. My job, thankfully, wonderfully, is that I was freely elected by a free body of believers to be the chief theologian of the church, to be its pastor. In other words, its shepherd. And I take very seriously that charge, and I have always felt that one of my jobs is to guard the flock by being able to help discern the issues and the powers that be in the times. And quite often, the powers that be in the world like to travel under smoke screens, under cover of something nicer that's actually bringing something destructive. And I felt for a long time in various phases now through 35 years that it reemerges in different ways, the erosion of our tradition, our gospel truths. So that's what I'm here to do tonight. That's why I'm functioning this way. That's why my job is to uncover something that quite often remains hidden. So again, we're going to pray in a minute before I actually start. This is all preamble. In terms of critical theory, there was a couple of questions I wanted to ask myself as I've been studying this now for some time. One is critical theory a worldview? Meaning a worldview is a coherent way of looking at the world that explains certain things about humanity and the world and our purpose. Explains what is the purpose of the human race, what has gone wrong, what can be done about it, and if something is done about it, what are we striving towards? Those are worldview questions. Christianity is clearly a worldview. We believe we were created by God in His image to have benevolent dominion over the world for His glory. We believe that what went wrong is humans chose against the will of the God who created us and plunged the world into chaos and death. We believe what has been done about it is that God, our Redeemer and Savior, has been on a steady process of calling us back to Himself, calling a particular people, which climaxed in the arrival of Jesus Christ, God incarnate, who died to take away our sins and rose to shatter the power of death. We believe that since that solution has appeared, the purpose of the people who know about it is loving mission, to love others and bring them this good news, and that ultimately God's will and kingdom will triumph, and that the new heavens and the new earth will be ushered in. That's a coherent worldview. You may or may not, I hope that you do, because I see you're mostly church people, agree with that worldview, but there are others. And so it's always helpful to know that when you have a theory of knowledge or a view of the world, like, yeah, we totally see the world through that lens. Of course we're biased towards this. Of course we are. We've chosen to be. But now the question is, are there other lenses through which to view the world, and would you like to compare them? Happy to talk to a non-Christian or a critical theorist and say, I totally admit I have a worldview. I have a total bias towards this, and I'm standing on 2,000 years of tradition of looking at the world this way. Let's talk. Can we talk about whether or not you have a worldview and what it is? Well, for me, the difficulty has been, one of the things I've discovered about critical theory before we get into it. I'm giving you this now because when we actually get into this, it's going to get really boring and thick. And you're going to go, oh man, I thought this would be so much more interesting. It's really hard to go through a worldview. And also, if you thought this was going to be like an edition of Tucker Carlson, it's not going to be. Okay, we're doing it from a slightly different angle than that. However, what I have discovered is that critical theory is an archon. By archon is one of the words that Paul uses when he talks about the powers and principalities that rule the air. And I'm not trying to get all heebie-jeebie with you about that, but there are influences under which cultures fall. They have power to them. They are archons. They tend to be the spirit of the age. Now, we all know the feeling of that when you go and go, man, that air was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. Did you feel the tension? Or did you feel like you're the only person in the world that thought that way? You're experiencing the presence in a minor way of an archon, of a kind of spiritual power. Well, critical theory is, in my view, an archon. It has power, and it takes power in the way that distortions of God's truth historically have done. By taking an attractive piece of the truth, such as concern for the oppressed, the poor, the marginalized, the beaten down, but attaching it to something that seems like a cause on their behalf that is actually destructive and antithetical to the gospel. Critical theory right now has the upper hand in terms of our cultural atmosphere. You'll see words about social justice from corporations, or you'll see Black Lives Matter on the back of helmets. I'm not saying Black lives don't matter. I fully believe that. But I'm talking about Black Lives Matter as an organization founded on critical theory by their admission. It is a power that exists, and it has some, to use their word, hegemony. It has some dominance. It's been working through our universities and our school systems for a long time. The fact that it's an archon is revealed to me in particular by my encountering and realizing that critical theory does not like to be examined. It doesn't like to be exposed. It does not like to be analyzed. Because slowing down to analyze and to test its theories and to test its philosophy removes one of its chief powers, which is urgency. It's another thing I've learned about critical theory. It is an urgent philosophy. It has moral urgency. This statue must come down now. No, we're not talking about it. It must be changed. This building must come down now. These people must be removed now. There can be no discussion. There's an urgency to it. And when you slow it down enough to say, why are you doing this? What is the belief behind what you're doing? You're very likely to be shouted at. You're very likely to be accused of bias or fragility or dominance. So to me, part of challenging the Archon is to actually take the time to do the work, which is not nearly as interesting as Fox News or MSNBC, who are always, pulling their angles very dramatically, to do the work to understand what's behind this. What's it for? A couple things I've noted too about critical theory is that I do think it's a worldview, but if a worldview has 5 steps like our worldview, creation, fall, redemption, mission, consummation, critical theory focuses on the middle 3 so much. What's the matter? What can be done about it? What are we supposed to do with this? It's very, very thin on why are we actually here? How do we get here? Very, very thin on the details of the utopia that should occur if it were fully enacted. It's very present-centered and very ahistorical, meaning without history, which is odd because you would think when you read critical theorists, they're always talking about history shows us that these people have always been oppressed by these people. But that is the only view of history that's there. Actually, it's quite a truncated view of history and is really mainly present-focused. The other thing that I find studying critical theory is that it is very non-transcendent. It's a very narrow view. It's a box that doesn't have any room for transcendent or revealed values or a transcendent or revealed person. There's a lot of other things too, but these are, the last thing that I have also noticed, critical theory is very strong on deconstructing things. Very thin, as far as I've seen, on what to construct in its place, on constructing things, which is going to be a key thing that we're going to see. So those are just some quick thoughts about the evaluation you can expect that I will, in my point of view, come around to an evaluation about it. But I want to talk about what it is, how we got there, what's going on, and I'll give you my evaluation. And then, somewhere about 30 to 40 minutes into it, we'll stop and take a few questions. Then I'll come back for some concluding remarks, and we will be done by 6:30. So if you need the bathrooms, you need to check NFL scores, go ahead and do that. No, Archon. It's a Greek word, like archetype means first, power. Okay, let's pray. God, thanks for gathering us here. Thank you for the power and beauty of your word. Thank you for your wonderful plan of redemption for us. And we pray that we would be able to fairly and adequately and truly distinguish between Christianity and critical theory tonight. In Jesus' name, amen. 2020, best year ever, right? COVID, George Floyd, civil unrest, wildfires, elections, and what will follow the elections. Surely some form of chaos, however they come out, right? It would just be par for the course. Well, this year, phrases emerged, phrases that have been around, but took on a new urgency for us. And they came on with some new sense of definition. Phrases like social justice, Black Lives Matter, and the reemergence of a word, equality. Now, on the face of it, all those are great phrases and words. I actually have never met anybody who didn't agree with any of those words. I suppose that they exist, but everyone is for social justice. I mean, who would go say, I am for social injustice. I want people to be oppressed. Well, of course not. But it's a good question of what does social justice mean? I mean, we see it all the time on our advertising, our sports teams now, the NFL and its quest for social justice. Great, but I guess it's great. Maybe it's not great. What does it mean? It's a word that we all think we know what it means, but we actually may mean very different things. Similarly, I have never talked to anyone with a contrary view to this. Black people matter. Yes. And there are particular sufferings amongst the black community in America that are grievous and difficult, and we're concerned about it, and it matters. Absolutely. But what does the organization that has such a great slogan, Black Lives Matter, actually stand for? What are their goals? That's a good question, and that's often not known. The slogan is so great that you think, I've got to be for that. Plus, I could lose my job if I don't. Also, we all say we want equality. What does equality mean? Do we mean traditional definitions such as equality before just laws evenly applied for all people? Is it equality of opportunity? Or is it the dream of the equality of outcomes? Equality only happens if everybody has all the same amount of stuff. Do we have to all end up with everything we want for there to be equality, no matter the level of our effort, our skills, our integrity, or our gifts? Now, over these questions of definition, I think we would all agree that polarization and hostility is rising. It's not decreasing. I've had lots of people who've lived some years say, I never remember it being like this. Contests were disputed, but never to such a degree of animosity and such hard lines drawn between, if you're for so-and-so, you are evil. I've heard that from both sides in this house. This is truly polarized. Interestingly, even a year ago, former President Obama addressed the call-out culture. You can look it up. The New York Times picked this up, the Boston Globe. In fact, he chastised young people today by saying pursuing being more woke than someone else or canceling people is not the way to a good and just society. Obama urged young people to move past that because real life, he said, is messy and ambiguous. Destroying each other online by proving that you are more righteously woke than someone else and defriending someone else, at least according to our former president, this call-out culture is not helpful. I think that's pretty interesting. Well, last May, from the early days, there was huge national lament over brutality, police brutality, over the death of George Floyd. I remember preaching a strong sermon about lament. This is just bad. The burden of being black in America was exposed. But many of us have perceived that since those times of shared national lament, where we felt unified over, this ain't right, let's change this, something else has risen. A particular way of addressing racism. And that's partly why, while critical theory applies in the realm of women's issues, sexuality issues, economic issues, we're particularly more focused in the last 3-4 months on the race issues. In fact, the hostility in sections of the social justice movement has turned literally violent. We've gone from mostly peaceful protests to extremely anarchic and violent protests. I got a great meme my son sent me. It was a picture from the Lord of the Rings movie. Imagine that would appeal to me. And it showed thousands of orcs descending on Gondor, on Minas Tirith. And it said, orcs protest outside Minas Tirith in a mostly peaceful protest. Pretty fun article if you want to check the Babylon Bee. All right, so we know so far, estimates are there's been $2 billion in property damage through non-peaceful protests, businesses, homes destroyed, buildings destroyed, and in particular recently violence against police. Not 2 weeks ago, police being shot in the face, and social justice leaders saying this was just retribution to the oppressors. You can look up those quotes. They're readily accessible online. We all feel destabilized, decoherent, as if something is pulling at the fabric of what holds us all together. How can this be? Is it really imaginable that human beings can police themselves? If only you got these people away from me, I would be very nice. That's not how it is on Sunday morning when no one's around and I'm late to church. I run red lights. And now I've said that online. Please don't come and give me a return ticket. All right, so there's something going on. There's something that is driving more than simply saying this isn't right. It feels to us like something is trying to be deconstructed. Something is trying to be torn away. So is there an ideology that drives this passion? Is it connected to what Obama called cancel culture? Is there some coherent worldview that gives resiliency to what we might call political correctness or cultural Marxism? Well, yes, of course there is. Prevalent in our universities, our high schools, and particularly our corporate diversity training seminars is a view of social interactions known as critical theory. Now that's a very nebulous term. It's so boring, right? It is so boring and benign for something that is anything but. But the word critical is used there in the sense of analyzing. You know, like literary criticism is not just saying you write poorly, it is saying, what is this story about? So critical in the sense of analyzing social structures, Douglas Murray's definition, to see through and undo the web that the culture you were born into has wound around you. It's the understanding that you and I are blinded by the culture in which we live, and that we need critical theory to help us analyze what's actually going on if we could get free of this web of dominant beliefs and social structures that has bound us and is causing so many people misery. So the idea is if you do that, then you can deconstruct the structures of the dominant which oppress people without our even knowing it. The idea is to unweave critical certainties that have cultural certainties that have protected the dominant social group in Western culture for centuries at the expense of minorities. So where did that come from? So here we go. I'm on the middle of page 2 if you're following along. And the fact is that Marxist thought underpins critical theory. This fact is not at all hidden by critical theorists. It's not disputed like, oh, how dare you call me a Marxist? No, remember your Marxism from growing up in school? Marx, following the philosopher Hegel, took this dialectical view of history. Do you remember all of that? Thesis, antithesis, clash together and create synthesis. And so for Marx, there was this vast inequity created by capitalism, that the rich were getting richer and the poor were getting poorer, and it was wrong, and it needed to be changed by a massive uprising of the proletariat, the working poor, to overthrow the rich overlords and create a utopia. Now, it's so interesting that where often slogans are like reductionist, the slogans from the communist days quite express it really pretty well. Remember the great theme that the Communist Party had? I remember seeing a march in London where these signs were held up which said, "Workers of the world unite." I was very young at the time. I thought, well, that sounds fine. Let's all get together. Workers of the world unite. What does that mean? Well, it meant workers of the world unite and throw off your overlords. Bring in the revolution that will bring about the days of peace and prosperity. And this was the other slogan, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Do what you love to do. Do what you're able to do, but share it all equally with everyone else so that whoever has need can have what they want. It's a beautiful idea. Wouldn't it be grand? It's sort of like the idea in Acts 2 and 3, where they shared everything that they had to try to take to each from according to his ability and means, to each according to his need. It's a great idea that it, because of human fallibility, doesn't work when it's enforced by the state. And so there was this credible problem, and that was in order to get the overlords to release their wealth so we could have this dream, violence was needed. Temporary violence, of course, just long enough for us to get everything in place, and then it'll all be utopia. Well, it never happened. Tens of millions of people were killed in Leninist, Stalinist Russia, in Cambodia, in Mao Tse-tung's China. And as George Orwell said in the 40s for An Animal Farm, all animals are created equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And the Communist Party, particularly in Russia, found that it liked being like the czars, and the great days of utopia did not happen. Another way to say it, The Who said it in the 60s, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. So what happened there? Well, for Marx, there was an idealizing of human nature, that individuals were, as Rousseau had said, blank slates. We had native goodness, corrupted only by unjust societies. It's kind of left, how did societies get unjust if everybody is pretty good, basically? It was a naive view that human nature was good and perfectible if only we could get the right social structure in place. Very different than the Christian view, which is that, as Jesus said, the heart is desperately wicked above all else. Very different than our American democracy that said, because of original sin and because of the depravity of humanity, we need to create a government with checks and balances against the tendency of governments to take too much power, so that in balance we can check one another's depravity and live a life of freedom. Interesting. Well, communism led to many other things. I mean, all you need to do is look up Soviet architecture from the 50s and 60s. You know, concrete, awful buildings. It was the bleakest of times, suppressed thought, poverty, a surveillance climate that still exists in both Russia and China, misery. So Marxism fell on hard times, particularly with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. You would think it would be an idea that would have gone away, but it just morphed into a different form. It picked up on some of the liberation movements that had been going on since the 60s. Women's liberation, sexual liberation, racial liberation. Some really good impulses there, like, yes, women should have the right to vote. Absolutely. People should be paid the same for equal work. Totally get that. Liberation movements in themselves aren't bad. It's a good thing. But what happened when they started merging with the previously disgraced Marxist ideology? So in 1985, this is down at the bottom of page 2, Laclau and Mouffe published a book called Hegemony and Socialist Strategy. There's a good use of a word that you hear a lot of in critical theory, which is hegemony. I think I've said that. I used to read it in my sci-fi novels and call it hegemony, but I think that that's not right. Hegemony means dominance or rule. The hegemony of the New England Patriots. We're all sick of it. What we want is the hegemony of the LSU Tigers. Okay, so they had this book in 1985 that asked this question. Now this, page 3, if you stop paying attention, youth in the back, don't stop paying attention. This is the key page for the night. So I'm going to give you, this is the connection you need to make. The rest of it is just falling out from that. So they wrote this. To what extent has it become necessary to modify the notion of class struggle in order to be able to deal with the new political subject, like women, national, racial, and sexual minorities, anti-nuclear and anti-institutional movements of a clearly anti-capitalist character, but whose identity is not constructed around specific class interest? In other words, we tried to rouse the proletariat. They weren't interested. They were hanging out, doing their deal. They didn't want the revolution. Dang. We forced the revolution. It didn't work. So what should we do? Because we still think this is the right way to read history, that those oppressed must take away power from those who have it. How can we do this? Let's find some aggrieved people who have a just cause. Perhaps the feminist cause. Perhaps racial liberation. Perhaps sexual liberation. What if we took our theories and bound them up not with an economic struggle, but with a social struggle, and bring them all together? They're all different right now. Let's bring them all together under the umbrella of Marxist thought. So you see that indented quote from them. Their enemy is defined not by its function of exploitation, but by the wielding of a certain power. This power is the outcome of the form of social organization characteristic of the present society. What do all these groups have in common? They want power. Let's bind them together under the quest to have social power taken away from the dominant and given to the oppressed. A marriage was imagined between socialist Marxist views of class war and the interest of minority groups seeking liberation. That's the foundation of critical theory. That's what's going on. It is by nature adversarial and deconstructive. It seeks to take down one to lift up another. The genius was realizing economically this thing doesn't work. It does not work. The West is just killing the East in this. So let's find another place to put it. Let's do it in terms of aggrieved groups of society. We need to dismantle power, recreate social structures, rework all the social mores to bring in the rise of different groups. So here we are down at the middle of the page. So here are some of the characteristics then that come out of critical theory. The key thing you need to do is delegitimize the hegemony. Call them bad names. Take away their power. Those who wield the most power and perpetuate it for their group have to be seen as having unearned, undeserved, unjust privilege. Make people envy them and hate them. They must be disrupted, discredited, and canceled so that those without power can now flourish. Boy, I got a taste of that. That was just coming into being in my years at Princeton Seminary in the 80s. And you could just feel the rise of the constantly offended culture. It was embarrassing to me. Our seminary was a collection of people who were always offended. That offends me that you said that. Constantly offended. Everything is adversarial because we're constantly saying, if you have, you shouldn't have. Only those who don't have are legitimate and need to be raised up. So there you see that bold-faced word. Power is the center driving force in the worldview of critical theory. That's another key thing to remember. It's all about power. I'm actually amazed that that's true and is not hidden, because I thought, who would actually say that? It's kind of like when I went through Fraternity Rush and someone said, you don't even want to go to those guys. All they care about is money. It's like, come on, man, it's the 70s. We already know that. Money can't buy you love. They'll be fine. And they were like, oh, you're from Miami? Do you have a boat? How big's your boat? It's like, really? You actually just are naked about the fact that money is everything? Well, critical theory is naked about the fact that it is about power. That's just the deal, which is it's one of those half-truths. Yes, human beings have a drive for power. Power exists. Power must exist. But the reduction of, is my whole life really only motivated by power? I remember an early critical theorist accused me of that in our previous church in our town of 18,000 in Lenore, North Carolina. And she said, maybe you're just pushing all of this, Orthodox Christianity because you want power. I was like, maybe I am. Because maybe being in this little church, in this little tiny town in the middle of nowhere is my idea of having a lot of power. Maybe. Or maybe it's about something else. Okay. So that leads to another word, a foundational word for critical theory. Came in an article by Columbia professor Kimberly Crenshaw. She's still teaching there. Actually is a woman who's concerned that her word is not being used how she meant it. But it's intersectionality. So this is where this is important to realize that because everything is about power, then what we need to do is map out where power exists and where it doesn't exist. If we're going to rebuild society and restructure it, we need a map of where the power structures are. So intersectionality is a framework for conceptualizing a person, group of people, or social problem as affected by a number of discriminations and disadvantages. It takes into account people's overlapping identities and experiences in order to understand the complexity of prejudices they face. In other words, intersectional theory asserts that people are often disadvantaged by multiple sources of oppression: their race, class, gender, identity, sexual orientation, religion, and other identity markers. Isn't that interesting? On the one hand, it's so obvious to be a truism. Many forces shape us. You can get into a place where there are many things that are creating and affecting your identity, your ability to do things, to purchase things, to go places, to have a career. Many forces shape us. But on another level, when taken into the struggle for power and the drive to overthrow the hegemony, intersectionality becomes a mean to identify wicked oppressors and the virtuous oppressed. Take a look on your next page. We'll come back to page 4. This is from a book by Robin DiAngelo and Özlem Sensoy called Is Everyone Really Equal? Robin DiAngelo is famous. Her bestseller is called White Fragility, and it is a very clear and very compelling view of critical theory. But this is from another book, Is Everyone Really Equal? So take a look at that blue chart, figure 5.1. This is how intersectionality works. The minoritized group, down the left side, would be peoples of color, the poor, the working class, women, transgender, genderqueer, gays, lesbians, bisexuals, Muslims, Buddhists, Jews, Hindus, people with disabilities, immigrants, and indigenous people. Those are all the minorities. The dominant group is white, owning class, men, heterosexual, Christians who are able-bodied, citizens of the United States, and white settlers. Do you see how this works? Do you see who is the hegemony and the dominators? And do you see how the oppressed must be liberated from the supremacy and privilege of that dominant group? Can you see how, given the Marxist liberationist warfare propulsion, critical theory feels like an attack on so many things that white people seem to hold dear? Can you see why, given this chart of intersectional power and oppression, white people under critical theory are called to repent, apologize, and stand down? It's mapped out. The more you're on the right side, the worse you are. The more you're on the left side, the more virtuous your social group is and needs to be elevated. And I'm not kidding when I say that. It almost embarrasses me to say that. So really, you're just saying, if you have power, you're not virtuous. If you don't have power, you are virtuous? Yes, we really are saying that as critical theorists. That's like, blows my mind in terms of worldview. All right, go back to page 4. Are you doing okay? Another 15 minutes, and then I'm going to let you talk some. So many concepts, but words like words we don't normally use: hegemony, intersectionality, but now you've got definitions for them. So it's great to grab some quotes from White Fragility because it's such a clearly written book. And DiAngelo draws together many of the strands of critical theory. One is called white privilege. This is how it's defined. From a critical social justice perspective, privilege is defined as systemically, that's a word we hear a lot these days, systemically conferred dominance and the institutional processes by which the beliefs and values of the dominant group are made normal and universal. So it's privilege if your group is the normal majority group. It's basically majority privilege. Now, because dominating groups occupy positions of power, their members receive social and institutional advantages. One automatically receives privilege by being a member of a dominant group. Like if you're not conflicted about your sexuality, if you're white, heterosexual, able-bodied, Christians, and the upper classes, you have, according to this, unearned and undeserved privilege, which actually plays into the use of the term white supremacy. This is, I think, a mistake on the part of critical theorists to take a word that is so pejorative and related to Ku Klux Klan and Nazi ideas and say, we don't really mean that when we use it, we mean something else, as if, and we're the ones that say language creates reality, as if it's not evoking this in people. It's a trigger word. Mistake to me because they're showing their hand. But what they say define racism as a systemic relationship of unequal power between white people and peoples of color. Whiteness refers to the specific dimensions of racism that elevates white people over all peoples of color. We use the term to capture the pervasiveness, magnitude, and normalcy of white privilege, dominance, and assumed superiority. Now, it's an unfortunate use of that term because it's so immediately inflammatory, but it truly is describing a reality. If you've ever been to, visited another country where you are not the majority color or the majority language or the majority culture, and you accidentally get dropped off in the wrong place and you're lost, suddenly you begin to realize, whoa, this is hard. I have no privilege. I have no cachet. How do I get out of here? I mean, I felt that. I was terrified the whole time I spent in Egypt, even though I was cocooned by people caring for me, because I thought, if I got dropped off on these streets, I don't know how to get home. I don't know how to talk to them. I don't know how the money works. That's the experience of people in our own American culture underneath the dominance of the fact that most of our culture for most of the time has been a white, Christian, capitalist culture. Not that it's wrong that there is a majority culture necessarily, but that we have to understand it is true that if you are not part of the majority culture, the world looks really weird and intimidating and thwarting. So what you got going on then, I think, with critical theory is looking at exposing some really important realities. This exists, right? This exists, that people who are not part of the dominant culture are always working underneath thinking, and for so long in television, people who weren't white and middle class with our values weren't even represented. There weren't characters of color. There weren't people of other ideas. And so the whole idea was, well, the world is white and I'm not, and I don't really know where I fit. It's an important reality to recognize. Using the word supremacy in that sort of implies that we all wish that we could go back to plantation days and that we're really intentionally working on this, and that, I think, is problematic. So the other phrase to get is white fragility. That's another phrase that's deliberately provocative about a different reality than it says. So, and this is the bottom of page 4, and this is a really key thing to learn about critical theory. There are so many things to learn about it, and it's so complex that when you start talking about it, it takes most of your time. So I'll keep moving. Bottom of page 4. The simplistic idea that racism is limited to individual intentional acts committed by unkind people is at the root of virtually all white defensiveness on this topic. For those of us who work to raise the racial consciousness of whites, simply getting whites to acknowledge that our race gives us advantages is a major effort. The defensiveness, denial, and resistance are deep. She's right. She's right. Have a conversation with folks in our church about racism, and they will say, hey, I never do anything mean to people of color. I'm for people of color. How could I possibly be a racist? And it's true, we are not conscious about how we participate in a majority culture that has rules that we know, language that we know, just by what we've absorbed, that makes it feel forbidding and difficult and challenging and inaccessible to people of different racial, ethnic, or economic background. That's a reality that as Christians we want to become more aware of. It's the truth. But problem, of course, will be that D'Angelo and others use the idea of white fragility to shut down any argument or resistance. If we want to say, well, we'd like to talk about that. No, you see, that's just what I'm talking about. As soon as I tell you you're fragile, you say, no. So it proves that you are. This happened to me when I was taking the mental tests that you need to take to become a minister. And one of the tests showed said, well, this test shows that you're contentious. I thought, okay, I can agree and I'm contentious, or I can disagree and I'm contentious. I see where this is going. It's not good. So the ideas of critical theory, to resist them is called a sign of your white fragility and your denial and your resistance. We have to be very careful to separate the two, because it does make me emotional. It does make me emotional to be accused of things that I am not consciously doing. But I have to be willing to deconstruct some of my own realizations in order to be open, to be listening, to be aware. All right, bottom of page 5, start at page 6. Another hallmark of critical theory is that knowledge and language is not objective. This is another key theory. All knowledge is taught from a particular perspective. The power of dominant knowledge depends in large part on its presentation as neutral and universal. On the one hand, that it's like so obvious you just want to yawn and say, right, and humans breathe air. Knowledge comes from a particular perspective. We all have a perspective. We got that. We got that from postmodernism that undercut the Enlightenment idea that rational knowledge was all that it was to know. Got that. And remarkably, the church has been answering that beautifully for the last 25, 30 years, saying, we totally do have a worldview. Let's share our worldviews and compare them together. Of course, all knowledge comes from a point of view. Let's talk about your point of view and our point of view and see which has the more compelling story. That's all good. But then there comes something else. Knowledge, down at the bottom, bold-faced, knowledge understood by humans is framed by the ideologies, languages, beliefs, and customs of human societies. Even the field of science is subjective. So one of the things that happens in critical theory is if you're discussing it and say, well, statistics show, there you go again, using that dominant language thing. Statistics come from your dominant, white-centered, Christian, Western point of view. You're not hearing the lived experience of the oppressed. You can't use statistics. You can't use rational thought. You can't use arguments because it shows your fragility. You have to just listen to these stories and take it. It's all intertwined. It's like, hey, listening to stories of people, there's experience, that's really important. It's really important, hugely important. But to say, as they do, that, well, you know, some knowledge is okay, like gravity, yeah, we agree that's universal, and the fact that you need to have enough money to cash the check you pay me to do the diversity workshop, that's real, that needs to happen. But these other statistics, social statistics, you know, the fact that people who stay married actually have a better chance of economic success, that's a biased statistic as part of your fragility. I don't want to hear it. It's very tricky in there, and that is something that in talking with critical theorists, we must insist on a definition of what are facts, what is scientific, and what is not. Because if you get caught in that bind, you're not allowed to argue, nor are you allowed to bring in facts. You just have to listen. There can be no countering to it. Okay, there's even more important stuff. Down in the middle of the page, social group identity supersedes individual concerns and is necessarily binary. Binary meaning two, meaning it's always opposites and in opposition. For every social group, there's an opposite group. The primary groups we name here through race, class, gender, sexuality are, even though we're individuals, we're also perhaps fundamentally members of social groups. Critical theory says what group you're in is more important than who you are as an individual. And that what group you're in means you're necessarily in opposition to a different group. If you're a man, you're in tension with women because you're keeping women down because that's what men do. If you're a woman, you're angry at men because they're keeping you down and you have to get over that. If you're white and black, brown and yellow, you're in competition with each other because each group is seeking its own power and you're in opposition with each other. And we've felt that in the last weeks. I feel it on the street. After all the upheaval, I think, man, Is that African-American guy, does he think it's my fault? Is he really mad at me? I don't even know if I can talk to him because I could be the problem. It's like, how did that happen? I wasn't mad at you, but now I think I'm mad at you because you're mad at me. You know, it's like grade school. Are you mad at me? Yeah, I'm mad at you, so I'm mad at him. And we are pitted against each other, and honest to goodness, critical theory is underlying the opposition between races and genders and even sexual orientations in our culture. It is necessarily adversarial because it's about power and it's about toppling the dominant power to achieve something else. That's where it leads. It sounds so good. We want to help oppress people. It is so divisive and so destructive. Okay, bottom of page 6, we mentioned this before a little bit. Critical theory asserts that if you're in the dominant group, you are blind to the oppression you are creating. And Vodi Bakum, who I really want you to watch, he is a fabulous African-American theologian, 6'7", Brazilian martial arts trained, lover of Jesus. He calls it ethnic Gnosticism. And that's the idea in critical theory that you can't know what you don't know. If I say, hey, what you said was racist, and you say, no, it wasn't, I didn't mean for it to be, and you say, yeah, well, it doesn't matter what you meant, that's how I took it, so it is racist. What a bind that is. Because if you're part of the dominant class, you don't know what you don't know. Only I know as part of the oppressed class, because the oppressed class has insight and virtue just by being oppressed that you as the dominant class don't have just by being dominant. Therefore, reality is what we tell you it is. It's nonsense. It's crazy. Coming in under something good. Coming in under the idea that, hey, for a long time, you haven't listened to my story. For a long time, you didn't know that saying that made me feel bad. I want to tell you about that. And if you say it right, I could go, oh, I didn't know that treating you that way, calling you those people, was hard for you. I'd like to change that. But if you never give me the benefit of the doubt and just say, yeah, that's racist whether you meant it or not, because you don't know what you don't know, but I do know, once again, we're pitted against each other. Once again, we're suspicious of each other. Once again, we're in a bind we can't get out of. Okay, so in conclusion about what critical theory is, the change that is needed is the awakening of both the oppressed and the oppressors to these intersectionalities of power and dominance. The change that's needed is divestment from the powerful, liberation of the oppressed, which will lead to utopia. Let's deconstruct, because once we deconstruct the dominant power structures, life will be great. Everybody will be happy. The actual details of how that will happen are not well worked out in the critical theory books. So evaluation of that. I'm going to go 5 more minutes on this, maybe 7. Critical theory is positive in that it recognizes injustice that exists and the misery under which people live, and asks those of us who have the ability to live in a bubble and not notice it, to see what is actually going on and to be concerned about it, and to be willing to adapt our lives even to the point of discomfort in order to care. Now, as Christians, that's a good thing. That's a good thing. The fact that I can live most of my life in Baton Rouge and not see any misery because of where I live and where I drive and where I work is probably something I should be convicted of in a city full of all kinds of misery. God's people should be beholding and involved in caring for suffering and misery and injustice. And if we're not, critical theory hammers us with, hey, what are you doing? That's true. Critical theory offers a voice to those who feel their voices have not been heard. And it offers a framework of explanation and a pathway to change for those who feel marginalization. Again, it's a good indictment on the church. If the church has not been seen to be coming alongside the least of the least and those who are struggling, then that misery will look for somebody else who wants to give me some reason, some purpose in life, some energy to try to change something. That's a word for us from critical theory. Those who don't feel they've been treated with equity and opportunity find a remedy offered through the project of awakening that critical theory offers. This particularly appeals to the young because it's so present-oriented, because it is so about a good fight. Young people have been under the thumb of their parents all their lives. So you take all this adolescent push, like, let me get out of the house, let me get away from the man, let me get out of school, and say, hey, use that same energy now to liberate the other oppressed people by taking down the man. Yeah, I'm for that, because surely it's got to be better than this. The youthful optimism, let's do it now, we'll tear it all down, it'll be great. Yes, and you're just young enough and just dumb enough to not know history and not know that it doesn't work and that some of the things you're tearing down have been here a long time for a reason. Nevertheless, critical theory inspires passion and offers purpose. If God's people are not inspiring young people with a similar degree of passion and purpose to help the oppressed, to change the world with the mission of the gospel, we're failing. We're stuck dealing with our nice things and our games and our distractions. Because really, it's all language that's been taken over from us. I love Ephesians. Wake up, O sleeper, and rise from the dead, and Christ will give you life. It's the original woke people. Yeah, I want to be woke. Wake me from the dead, Lord Jesus. Wake me from the dead and employ me in your mission. So followers of movements undermined by critical theory, underpinned, have moral outrage and moral imperative upon them. It's very appealing. There are clear standards of virtue and righteousness. There's self-policing. I'm always talking about what I shouldn't say and talking about what you shouldn't say. And social pressure to enact these virtues. Followers strive after righteousness and believe our best society will come after their success. Plus, it is a lot more fun to go to a rally with thousands of your peers and get whipped up about a cause than it is to go every single week to sit with some distracted, snotty-nosed kid as a mentor and change a life. It is a lot easier to be outraged over the man than it is to drive to Angola every Monday night and go through security and experience what it's like to be imprisoned as you sit with people in a Bible study. It is a lot easier to throw frozen water bottles at police than to spend weeks building a habitat house. It has an appeal to it. However, critical theory, in my evaluation, offers, this I'm in the middle of page 8, a shallow view of history, a seriously truncated view of human identity, and an accurately adversarial view of human relationships. It has a fallaciously optimistic view of human nature and a tediously narrow view of human motivation. Historically speaking, critical theory fails to account for the immigrant experience of America. It fails to understand the motivation for the people groups that flooded our shores in our first centuries until now. People seeking religious freedom, economic opportunity, political freedom. If everything's defined in power, it's as if everybody came over here just to have power over Indians and slaves. That's ridiculous history. That's not true. My underfed, Cro-Magnon-looking Frisian ancestors from the north of Holland lived on potatoes and were persecuted for their religious beliefs. And they came to a wilderness and carved out a life. There was no thought of someone else is doing this. I'm living off of someone else's labor. It was their labor and their desire to create something that was free for the expression of their faith and to better themselves. It's no accident that if you look at the per capita income today of non-white immigrant groups, that the per capita income among many of them is higher than the per capita income of white people. Ethnic groups come here and they succeed. Asians, all kinds. I left my sheet that has the stats. I can show it to you. Critical theory does not see that there's a reason why people want to be in America, because you don't have to be white to succeed. You don't have to be a native English speaker to succeed. You don't. The identity view, this truncated view of identity, that our identity is primarily defined by our placement in one of these groups: race, sexual desire, internal gender desire, or biological sex, and then placing these in conflict with others, is ridiculously shallow diminishing of the richness of our shared humanity. And that is just so important. Christianity has a view of shared humanity among all people. We believe we came from one ancestor. We are all genetically related, and we all are made in the image of God. That has been the consistent Judeo-Christian teaching for 3,500 years. It was revolutionary at the time, it still is. We also have a shared view of our shared mutual sinfulness. Each one is fallen. Suffering is not an index of virtue, to quote Robert Penn Warren. You're not more righteous because you suffer more. Suffering doesn't create virtue. We are each created by God and each fallen, and each have available to us the redemption that's in Jesus Christ. I got to make a side road here. I was only going to lecture, but I got to preach just a little bit. The bottom of page 8. Where did our Christian views come from? We were working on a mentoring program at our church in North Carolina. We're talking about the connection between the church and the school, and the woman who was leading it said, "Now remember, don't bring your white middle-class values to these kids." I said, "What values are you talking about?" She said, "Well, you know, that Christian stuff, all your white people values." It's like, really? Really? It seems to me I got my values from a group of people who had been enslaved for 400 years. 400 years. Who for centuries after their freedom had no political power. They were Semitic people, much darker skinned than I am. They didn't speak English. They lived in a tiny region in the Middle East, surrounded by people who hated them. But they managed to create a way of viewing the world and ordering society and talking about justice that's influenced the entire world for 3,500 years. Most of their values are values that you're living from. My specific Christian worldview arose 2,000 years ago. Acts 2, 9 and 10 names 13 different ethnicities and languages who embraced the gospel story on the first day of the church's existence. 13 named. There were more. The influencers in my worldview, those who formed our theology, came from places like Turkey, Egypt, Algeria, Ethiopia, Syria, Rome, and Gaul. My whole story was worked out before anybody with anything remotely like my skin color had ever even heard of it, and long before the English language had any shape like the one we hear now. In 2010, of the 2.2 billion Christians in the world, only about 37% live in countries considered white or European dominated. It is a fallacy to allow someone to say that Christianity is a white religion. That's ridiculous. It's also interesting to note that in 2014, 79% of Black Americans identified as Christians. It's nonsensical to deny that Christianity offers a significant bridge between Black and white communities. The lived experience of Christians across centuries and languages and countries and ethnicities is astounding in its uniformity. I can read the confessions of an African bishop from 400 AD and recognize my own spiritual experience. I can also read the musings of a 13th century nun, woman, and recognize the same thing. Christian spiritual experience is uniform, connected, like, across ethnicities and nations and languages and ages. It's a powerful unifying force. To be allowed to have that parsed up into saying, yeah, that's all white man stuff, that's ridiculous. We must not let that stand. Okay. The absence of reference to a higher power in critical theory is significant. The whole project, I'm at the bottom of 9, is predicated on human ability to enact those goals. I think I pretty much said enough. No, there's still a little more. Sorry. This is a lot of work, kids. Take a look at the top of page 10, The Motivation of Power. I recommend to you Douglas Murray's book, The Madness of Crowds. There's a resource page on here. You can look all this stuff up. But Douglas Murray says, these thinkers absorb their idea of society not as an infinitely complex system of trust and traditions that have evolved over time, but always in the unforgiving light cast when everything is viewed solely through the prism of power. Viewing all human interactions in this light distorts rather than clarifies, presenting a dishonest interpretation of our lives. Of course, power exists as a force in the world, but so do charity, forgiveness, and love. That's enormously important. The notion that privilege as unearned fails to account for the tremendous effort required to maintain privilege through responsibility. It fails to account for the enormous American privilege that is the reality of anyone who lives in this country, who drove on paved streets, sits in an air-conditioned building with electricity that only goes off when there's a storm. We live as privileged people, and it takes an enormous amount of effort to continue to live, to keep the lights on, to keep the streets clear, to keep laws functioning as the rule of our lives. To simply say, because you have privilege means you're bad, really fails to understand the lived experience of people who have enormous responsibility for maintaining our commonwealth. And the question that has to be asked is, what's to change if the nature of the dominators switches? I mean, that is, I think, the key question to ask critical theorists. Right, okay, I'm everything on the right side of the list. I am the hegemony. So if you take all my stuff and you take my country and you have it, what's to say that you're going to be different than I am as a dominator? How do I know that you'll be any different as I'm contemplating standing down from my position of privilege? Now, our founding fathers knew that because all human beings are sinful and depraved, we need checks and balances. The communist experiments in politics have showed that the new boss is often worse than the old boss. The fact of critical theory fragility, that argument has to be shouted down with moral outrage, is also, I think, fallacious. Okay, so down at the bottom of the page, I really am winding up here. Tim Keller's article on critical theory is so important. This is a really key thing to know in terms of worldviews. Critical theory, I think, is particularly appealing to the young who are energetic and not yet exhausted. But I will tell you that living your life by critical theory in the quest for liberation under human power is absolutely exhausting and frightening. Because under critical theory, there is no means of forgiveness or atonement. There's a constant quest to be more awakened than you were before, and to be more awakened, woke, than the last person. And it is an unceasing drive to perform signs that you are virtuous and that you are pursuing the deconstruction of dominance and the rise of the oppressed. It is works righteousness in ways that the Catholic Church only wishes they had thought of. It is so incredibly demanding and crushing in its weight. And if you cross a tripwire and say the wrong thing or back the wrong person, there is no mercy. You will be canceled. Because critical theory works on shame. Once upon a time, we were a culture that was based on truth and error. What matters is who actually hit the other person first. Once upon a time, it mattered what are the facts. I think that's still the way rule of law is supposed to work. But there's been a push towards changing our culture to an honor-shame society, where what matters is not whether or not you are correct and have facts, but whether or not you are on the right and virtuous side, and whether or not you should be shamed for not being where you should be. The power of shame is incredibly powerful and also enormously dampening of creativity, humor, and fresh ideas. I'll just say this. I believe that Black Lives Matter is an important slogan for these days. I believe that that organization, by their own admission, is deeply entrenched in critical theory. If you look up, just Google Patrisse Cullors, co-founder of Black Lives Matter, and she will tell you I'm a trained Marxist. I was trained in community organization according to a critical theory worldview. And I think that the fact that we see violence and a push to defund police, to dismantle society, is evidence of that. I thought for a long time, why is there such a focus on defunding police when there are so many problems afflicting the African American community? And I thought, the police are the literal enforcement of the hegemony. They are the actual physical enforcement of the dominant culture. That's why they have to be delegitimized and defunded, so that something else can take its place. It's frightening to me. Do I think there should be police reform? Absolutely. Better training? Absolutely. But a world without police, made up of depraved people like me, is not a good thing. My final shot is to say the Spanish Inquisition, it's not just for churches anymore. It's all around us, and it needs to be resisted. Okay, wow. Sorry, I didn't know that would take so long. We do have a few minutes for questions. I have a few other things on the sheet, but maybe you have thoughts or comments you'd like to ask in our final 12 minutes. Yes, Gigi.
Gerrit, I mean, this was so revealing to me. You have taken, I've had scattered thoughts. Is there a way just within the body of our church that we can continue this discussion?
Funny you should say that. Sitting behind you is Jeff Swarner. He and Hank Mills are doing a class on these kind of issues every Sunday for the next few weeks. Yes, Clint, shout it down and I'll repeat it so they can hear it.
Yeah, so great. When you talk about if I must deconstruct things as kind of the agenda, white, male, heterosexual, and stuff. But if I can't argue, if I can't object, if I can't say I'm sorry enough, how does one interact and, perhaps to a friend recognize that the oppressor is not outside, but within, as I would say, sin is the oppressor.
Yes, yeah, it's a great question. He's asking about if the bind that we get in as being part of the hegemony, if we can't argue or reply. And Robin DiAngelo, she is merciless. She even has a chapter on white women's tears and says, so if you're a white woman and you hear about this and you cry over racism, that's racist. In other words, one critic has said DiAngelo's book wants to bind, suffocate, and choke white people into just saying, and she's white herself, just in saying, I don't know what to do. I think the answers are, one is to be able to say, let's share lived experience. Let's talk about what we experience together and kind of agree on, would you give me 10 minutes if I gave you 20 minutes, and we'll talk. Invite a conversation. I think like arguing these things is probably pretty unproductive. Mostly, I think, though, as Christians, is that this is why I'm so thankful and glad to be part of this church. Is somebody actually put on our Facebook, why aren't you all out helping people? Why are you having these kind of seminars? It should be canceled. And it's like I really resisted. And if you're listening, this is my reply to you. I want to say, do you want to come help? Please, I got a team going over to Lake Charles this week. We're having a blood drive because people need to give blood. Would you like to go to Gardeer and mentor a child with me once a week? What would you like to do? Because we want to be doing things that empower people working alongside of folks. Let's help people enjoy the dream of home ownership by contributing sweat equity together with Habitat. Let's get involved together. Let's go work at a soccer camp for Project Stars and be out together. That powers away all the arguments, because yapping at each other about how bad we are does much less than when we're actually constructing something together.
Help us answer questions with people who are discounting the entire American evangelical movement from the First Great Awakening on, because people like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield didn't speak out against racism
Sure.
and might have owned slaves.
I think Tim Keller is good on this, and one is one of the part of the kind of the madness in our current culture is expecting people to have current consciousness 300 years ago or 200 years ago. It's just impossible. And maybe one of the ways to say it is, at some point, if we do what we're asked to do, which is to follow the science, we will all realize that the science tells us that from the moment of conception, there is a genetically complete human being. And the more we see into the womb, the more we see how clearly the child inside the womb is a human being. And when we get that, we're going to look back and say, how did people in the 21st century not see that? How did they actually abort hundreds of millions of human beings? And then the question is, thinking about that, do we then need to go back and say, well, because you were for abortion, nothing you did in your whole life was right? And you could make that case. Like, wow, that's a pretty heinous thing. But on the other hand, if you recognize fully human fallibility and our sinfulness, you realize that we are all culturally bound. Keller asked the question, how do you even know that your view of what is right now is correct? 200 years from now, we may have an entirely different view of what is right. So to project back on people who strove to live a virtuous life and did really incredibly constructive things and say, well, because you got it wrong here, because you were part of an entire culture that had it wrong and you didn't see through it, you should be totally blotted out of history. That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous, because there's so many things that, you just look at the difference between generations. People used to throw trash out their car windows because you just did. People used to leave their trash in movie theaters because you just did. Now you think, no, I can't, no, I never did that. Oh yeah, you did. There are things we used to do. We used to treat, I'm sorry, it's just the shallowness of reading history that way. When you realize the point of privilege that we all stand in, that we all in America live beyond basic survival to such a degree that no people have ever lived. Human society is a brutal struggle for survival. The things that happen in men-women relationships when, literally you needed a big man to protect you from wild animals and marauders. You know, society gets ordered around the threats that we're facing. The fact that we don't have so many diseases, that we have clean running water, that we live more than 40 years, that we have time to think about things, gives us a different perspective. And it's poor history to read our biases back into another time. Okay. One rule in answering questions is don't go too long.
Bouncing off of what he was saying, though, and it's going to be a rhetorical question. I find that the more I see this critical theory popping up in different aspects of our culture, be it race or be it whatever else is being talked about, I do my own research, and I always come to the conclusion of it's a half-truth.
Yep.
They're taking a half-truth and making it the whole subject.
Yes.
For instance, about our heritage as a country, we were trying to get rid of slavery before we became a country. Do we all know that? It's really important. So I guess the question I have is, how do you compete with the half-truths and the effort to spark controversy,
Right.
rather than say, here is the reality, here is our real history?
Yeah, it's a great question. Half-truths. Half-truth is so key because that's exactly how in the church heresies work. You take a half-truth, make something easier than the whole truth, and then start to import other things with it. Van Morrison has one of his new songs, I love Van, he says, brainwash is easy when everybody's lazy. You know, we have to be readers of history. We have to be excavators of facts. And also, I think our worldview has such a realistic view of people. I mean, enslaving people, it's what we do as human beings. The idea, oh, I would never do that. Oh, yes, you would. You know, oh, those Nazis, I can't believe they did that. Most of them were nice people like the rest of us. Like, we do that. We commit genocide. We have sex trafficking that's going on right now. There are human slaves in the world, and it's happening. We do it. We participate in all kinds of stuff. And until we get rid of this rosy idea that it's those bad people that are holding me down and realize it's me that needs the grace of Christ, you know, that's huge. So our status as beloved and sinful is just enormous, is huge. I think one of the things critical theory does is its urgency. It's so urgent that it keeps you focused on a very, very narrow place. And it always wants to deflect attention from origins and end goals and from the heart. It wants to keep it all here. It's such a narrow box. And you got to push through those deflections. One more, then we'll quit.
I just wonder about the true cause of oppression in our country. You know, there's poverty, there's generational families for generations that are on welfare and not getting out, and making an excuse that the white supremacists are holding them there. Anyway, I was just wondering if you can address maybe the elephant in the room that's not being addressed.
Yeah, probably not in 2 minutes. Where her questions about the cause of oppression, one, it's because it's, as I said, it's what we do. Two, I don't think we can overestimate the power and consciousness. And Albert and Adrian, you're here, you could correct me or shed more light on this. But the reality of slavery for 200-300 years, and then the reality of indentured service after that, and the attitudes in the country has created a real sense and consciousness that makes it more difficult than someone like me who was given so many opportunities where if my family just said, well, just work harder and you'll do better, that was open to me. But to just say, well, you know, if you just pulled yourself up and worked harder, everything would be fine, I think that's too simplistic. I think, however, that when you think about Jesus dealing with most of his disciples were an oppressed, occupied, minority, hated group in the world, and Jesus arrived in their midst and said, not, man, you got it hard. He said, you are the light of the world. You are the salt of the earth. Your Father loves you more than he loves the sparrows and the lilies of the field, and you have a role to play, and I'm summoning you to that. You know, that's one of the things the gospel can do, which is to call people, instead of saying you can't, to say you can, because you're called to that. But it has to be done, I think, in a particularly loving and sensitive way. Do you?
I totally agree with Gerrit. Thank you so much for putting this on. And as I was sitting there listening, I'll go back to the late 80s and the mid 90s, when my brother and I was in the restaurant business right there on the north end of LSU campus and the south end of LSU campus. And one of the things that really caught my attention, that most of the crime from our community was on the north end of LSU campus. And right there at LSU, to me, what I began to see, it was like an imaginary line.
Right.
It's like they wouldn't even cross to go do anything. And I understand even better now with what you shared with critical theory. But when I talk to us as a people, we do not fight against dominance or lack of dominance. That is not who we are.
Right.
We are not a people that have felt like white people had all of the power and we had none of the power. In the last few months, in talking to different people from different walks of life, one individual just recently, Adrian and I were sitting down and we was having a meeting. And in the meeting, something came up that shocked me and shocked her. This person is an insurance agent from about 20-something years. And they made the statement to us that most of the black insurance agents in this particular entity lives on the north side of town. And when one of the individuals decided that they wanted to move into the south area of town, they caught a lot of slack from the authorities in that particular arena. So much pressure that they just resigned from that organization and went and done something else.
Yeah.
And then talking to other individuals, just recently I went to NFL ex-players, and one from the early 80s and one from the 60s. And I never knew this. And they said, from the 60s, said, when I went to the NFL, I caught so much slack from the opposite individuals, even as good as I was. Plus, there were positions that seemed to be set for whites only. And then the one that went to the pros in the 80s said, that's the way it was when I got there. Said that blacks was not middle linebackers until later on in the professional arena. Mm-hmm. Blacks was not strong safeties until later on in the professional arena. So it never was for us a matter of we being powerless and then others having the power. It's a matter of the same playing field and being able to have the abilities within any organization with the skill level, the expertise, to be able to move forward without feeling like because of my skin color, I'm held back. And so even when it deals with, I think, with the question that was asked, is that yes, and I saw it on the paper, yes, there are issues that are much greater with fatherless homes and things like that that has to be dealt with. But when we talk about us as a people, we are not feeling like white people have all of the power. It's the fact that let the playing field be level in every area so that when we do arrive, we don't feel like we're being cheated out of something just because of the fact that
Amen.
maybe
Right.
we have been oppressed and we feel like oppression is still over us. I think those days are over with. And as I watched and listened, even what happened in the last 5 months, those things just awakened something that already existed. And it just so happened people like Black Lives Matter and that organization and what they are underlying doing stood up and became the predominant voice.
Right.
As it relates to what's going on now. But as you said earlier, as the church, we must become that dominant voice.
Amen to that.
To be able to bring what God says that needs to be done and has to be done, even as we're doing as a church now, to be able to combat everything that the adversary is throwing out there.
Exactly. Thank you, Albert. Beautifully said. That's a point Douglas Murray makes in his book, that particularly in the areas of both feminism and in race relations, that it looked like we were actually moving forward as a society in opening access, and that somehow, under the influence of critical theory, we've been led to believe that there's a battle that doesn't actually exist and that we should be adversarial with each other. And it's ridiculous. What are you? One last one, yeah, because we're over time.
It's actually more a comment than a question. I wanted to speak specifically. I definitely do understand what you're saying about critical theory, and I wanted to basically say that this isn't the first time or the first name. There are people who would argue that the Black Power movement during the Civil Rights movement was the same thing. I just want to encourage you all to not get stuck on this, because these issues are very real. I am a survivor from police brutality here in Baton Rouge, where I was told by an attorney I would never find an attorney that would fight the Baton Rouge police. I do understand you said that, you know, we have these specific, we do need to listen to people, and about the data. There's actually a website, mappingpoliceviolence.org, that talks about police brutality. So while it is definitely not the Christian way, we do need to figure out a way as Christians, because it is real. It
Amen.
Definitely exists right here in Baton Rouge. And I don't want to defund the police, definitely not, because I want to feel safe in my home.
Yes.
But police brutality is real.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good
we
word.
definitely need to do something about it. I'm sorry, almost. I know we got
No,
to
it's
go.
fine. Go ahead.
I want to read what Martin Luther King said about the Black Power movement. He said, Black Power was essentially an emotional concept that meant different things to different people. And so with the Black Lives Matter movement, it means different things to different people. But he worried that the slogan carried connotations of violence and separatism and opposed its use. So while he was against Black Power, he definitely was for equality. He definitely was for the rights of African Americans. So I get it. I understand. We definitely don't need to be part of the cancel culture, but we can't pretend. We can't even come close to pretending like this doesn't exist right here in this city. There is data that says that this is real. And yeah, so that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you for that.
Thank
It's
you.
wonderful. And such a great quote from Martin Luther King. Letter from a Birmingham jail. I just read that a couple of weeks ago, and such beautiful, wonderful Christian sense towards both impelling us towards welcome, inclusion, and justice without tripping into the violence. So I'm really glad you brought that up, and thank you for that. All right, folks. In fact, and the Mapping Police Violence, that website is listed later in the notes. I will tell you, when you look at anything where there's statistics, you can find all kinds of statistics. Don't look at it now. Take it home. But if you find contradictory statistics, I'll believe you. It's just really hard to even get a glimpse, because people do statistics so many different ways. All right, we're past time, but you have been a wonderful audience, and I am so grateful for that, and hope that you have a wonderful night, and to be continued. Thank you.